This is looking more promising. The question is, when will we be in World War III?
Well, there you go. I am enjoying Zelensky's satire. His comedy's sure doing him Churchill well and Patton well. Basically, he's doing this, but with polysyllabic words, and
right. Well, 9 o'clock Wednesday morning is going to be before the Congress of the United States. Mm-hmm. And it occurred to me that maybe we should declare war on Putin, not on Russia. And
it's
say that he's a gangster and he has to be brought to justice.
And I would agree here, because it's not this normal 7-headed hydra where you cut off one and two come back. I think there's been a billionaire complacency of sitting back and being basically yes men, yes women, because he's not just out of control. He's literally 4-year-old tantrum, and I want my bottle.
Yep. So, and tonight they're talking about China and Taiwan, and of course that's near and dear to my heart, because that's how I was prepared during my time in the Marines to be prepared to defend Taiwan, and I think that the U.S. will do. We have a long history of dealing in the Formosa Strait, and so that could get very problematic very quickly. And
I think yes, and I kind of think these are the last loud throws of Russia, and the ally with China as a different axis. It feels to be China is a legitimate power. It's just their economy is so tied in a different way than ours is so tied together that they feel at a scale much bigger than Russia, but unexperienced out here. The 4,000 year sequestration, so to speak. But I don't know. I kind of feel like, the war against Putin, not against Russia.
Yeah. And
did you see on the Russian news, they had someone live, and then someone had a sign of, no war behind him playing that game.
Yeah. That's a courageous woman that did that. Good evening, Justin. Okay. So we are who we are, and we're going to begin tonight with part 2 of essay 2 of this book, 2 essays on analytical psychology. And we have to start wondering whether Dr. Jung is pointing at us. So we have to be reflective of this. This section 2 is called Phenomena Resulting from the Assimilation of the Unconscious. So in other words, when you start to get the unconscious blasting through on you, what do you do with it? And what do you do with it? That's a big issue. And so anyway, paragraph 2, go ahead.
Just quickly, I would say too, I'm still looking for it. We'll find it as we go through, maybe. But the point of assimilation of the unconscious, where you become comfortable with the not knowing while daily getting things done, and you're not in the intensity of the shit, so to speak, on the front line. You are the front line, but you also are the back line and all the other ones inside. So I kind of I haven't read this in so long. I'm hoping that at some point he comes to the healthy assimilation example, where someone is just, they may have a lot of fear, but they're abjectly unafraid, unthreatened,
Yeah.
and they're living. So, and like you quote, the nourishing qualities of the psyche emerge and emanate into daily life. And that's the purpose of art kind of thing.
Yep. And I guess if I find myself telling me I should go join the Ukrainian resistance, then I'm in trouble.
Yeah. And you just muted accidentally. So yeah, I hear you. So you muted accidentally.
It wasn't accidental. I just didn't want to blow my nose through everybody's headset.
Thank you.
And Justin says, half of what we now hear Russian says on the news is incorrectly translated and important points are cut out. I don't doubt it. So let's try to understand our psyches a little bit more tonight. We may come back to Russia and Taiwan at some point, but you know, I hope that President Biden can hold his water and not get us into a battle and into World War III. And I guess Congress has the war-making power. And so if they vote for a war after Zelensky speaks to them on Wednesday, then we might have another thing to think about here.
You know, and I think that's an important statement, because historically, I hate to put it this way, but with not learning from history, it's again time, and that's unfortunate. But at the same time, I think, as I mentioned before we got on, Zelensky's comedy aspect is making some wonderfully biting wit that's also generally and legitimately unthreatened. And if you look at, you know, the Molotov cocktails, the Ukrainians taking tractors, the memes of the Russian ships out there, oh, well, they took our armored vehicles, but we're safe out here, and you see a tractor coming across the ocean. I mean, there's a fierceness there that to me is not that's not posturing. It's not it's not inflated. It's a big giant capital N note. So
yeah, well, I think that Ukrainians suffered a lot at the hands of Russians over the last century, going back to Stalinist times, when you know, about 20 million Russians were killed by Stalin, and at that time Russians included Ukraine, and I think that a lot of those people that died were Ukrainian.
I agree, and I think the Stalin aspect too comes into play with a war against Putin, not a war against Russia, because there was a point where Stalin had created so much fear that, and he'd also killed most of the doctors, that when he had a heart attack, no one would touch him for fear of reprisal and death. And so, of course, he, in that sense, created his own demise.
Eventually he did. But anyway, there's a book called The Red Tsar. I urge everyone to read it. It's very interesting. It's about Stalin's Russia, and it's a very interesting read, and it's very sobering the way those folks think. So, okay, paragraph 221, and this is in phenomena resulting from assimilation of the unconscious. I'll read the first paragraph. The process.
Or
say it again.
You got it, or you want me to lead us out?
Yeah, you can read it if you want. Go ahead.
paragraph 221, the process of assimilating the unconscious leads to some very remarkable phenomena. It produces in some patients an unmistakable and often unpleasant increase of self-confidence and conceit. They are full of themselves. They know everything. They imagine themselves to be fully informed of everything concerning their unconscious and are persuaded that they understand perfectly everything that comes out of it. At every interview with a doctor, they get more and more above themselves. Others, on the contrary, feel themselves more and more crushed under the contents of the unconscious, and they lose their self-confidence and abandon themselves with dull resignation to all the extraordinary things that the unconscious produces. The former, overflowing with feelings of their importance, assume a responsibility for the unconscious that goes much too far, beyond all reasonable bounds. The others finally give up all sense of responsibility, overcome by a sense of the powerlessness of the ego against the fate working through the unconscious.
Yeah. Okay. So what we're talking about here is, I guess, inflation or deflation.
Mm-hmm.
And well, I've never been in therapy per se, so I can't speak to analysis per se, but I know that, there came a time in 1993 when I was sort of at loose ends. I was trying to decide what I was going to do with the rest of my life. And Debbie was away for some reason. I forget. She was often traveling in those days. And so I went for a long walk. It happened to be the day of Norman Schwarzkopf's War Parade. So I know that I could find the date, right?
Right.
It was the date that Norman Schwarzkopf marched through Washington. And I was dead set against that because I don't think we should aggrandize our military.
Right.
And so I walked around the Capitol and I came to the conclusion, I was trying to decide what I should do when I grow up. And I guess I was, 46 at that point. And I decided that I should be a writer. And then I said, oh, now wait a minute, I've always been a writer because I've always been helping people get money to do things one way or another. But then I said, well, I want to be a novelist. And I had just read an article about Michael Crichton, who had just had a big success with Jurassic Park. And he was asked, this was in the Wall Street Journal. So he was asked, what do you do? How do you write a novel? And he said, well, you ask a question and then you answer it. And so his question, obviously, which was, what happens if dinosaurs come back to life or are brought back? And my question had been the question about the young Japanese farm girl who ends up going to Tokyo to earn her dowry. Now, that when I started to think about that, I started to write, and within 2 days, I was possessed by my anima. And for the next 8 months, I didn't have any choice but to write this story. And it's a true story. Everything that happens in that story happened to me or someone I know intimately. And except it's a novel, of course. And the main novel part of it is that that girl becomes the first woman prime minister of Japan. And so the novel covers what happens to her during that 60-year period from age 15 to age 75. And at the end of it, I just put it in a drawer because it was like radioactive. And, you know, if I had written something that, you know, the issue with that experience was that some of those chapters were pornographic, and I was still in my business career, and I said, you know, do I really want to bring this out into the public domain? And finally, I decided that I would do it. I would publish it when I was 70. And I actually jumped the gun and published it a couple of years early, but only on Kindle. And but what happened to me about it was, wow, that was awesome. And wow, I'm not a bad writer. People like this book, the ones that read it. But I made my own decision that it just shouldn't get out into the public at that time. And so someone else wrote a book called Diary of a Geisha, and he got a bestseller, and I had mine in the drawer.
Well, what I respect most, I think, about that whole process is that you allowed that, you entered it, you intensely engaged it, but you didn't do what a lot of people do, is then confess it in such a way that becomes an indelible historical self-undermining. You realized with perspective during it that this is mine, it's important, but I'm not letting it out there. And not so much for fear of reprisal, but that when you were done, and you didn't want to, in a sense, deal with that anymore. And
by the time by the time I had gotten to that point at the end of it, I had read enough Jungian psychology to know what I was dealing with. And
I think that applies to this first paragraph, because then I think both these conditions, the inflation and deflation, both infer a lack of parenting that applies to both, a lack of self-parenting, where you then went, oh, okay, well, no, this is my resolve.
Yeah.
This is my position, and I need not self-sabotage just to get through it and get approval from anybody else. You had your own self-sufficiency in that sense. And in a sense, you were past this first paragraph. I mean,
right on. So anyway, I did have a kind of inflation at that time, but I just instead of writing novels, I decided to read Jung more, or read about Jung more, because I wasn't yet in the habit of reading Jung directly.
Well, I think that's important, because in my own personal experiences, those times when I have, quote unquote, exceeded myself, then there are times I'll give myself time in the background to grow into my new britches, so to speak, instead of jumping out there and, rah, 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 because I realize I have a larger self to wield now, but relative to where I was before with just general healthy confidence, I'm deflated in regards to the new whole, and time needs to happen for that to, it's like a crab shedding its shell. It goes under the rock to reacclimate. And that can take days, hours, weeks, years, a lifetime. But I think your discernment point to put it in a drawer was, you allowed the experience intensely, but you didn't allow it to rule you. It was simply another council voice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, there's some interesting comments here. Justin says that the Ukrainians suffered more in Soviet times than during World War II. Ukraine and Germany were allies. Okay, I'm not sure what the context was that they were allies and what part of Germany we're talking about, Justin, because there was East and West Germany until 1989, I guess, something like that. And so I don't know what we're exactly talking about here. But he says, aren't there dinosaurs around today in the parliaments? Yeah, for sure. And then Torp Hodel says, Klaus Schwab insights. He's playing a bit with the European thing. Do you understand that comment?
Playing with the European thing, sure, but the East and the West Germany pieces are still, to me, a little out of context because, back to, I guess I'm kind of harping on stamps in the last couple of weeks, but there were two very distinct sets of stamps issued. I mean, two different governments completely. It wasn't just a faction civil war of East and West Germany. It was a country split in two countries. And so I kind of see the path he's on. I just don't see the road that's traveled. I mean, if he could clarify, that would be helpful.
Yeah. All right. Well, folks, I'm going to ignore comments about that are heavily about Ukraine unless we get really sucked into it. There's plenty of talking heads about that online. I guess what we should keep in mind as we read these paragraphs is that normal people who don't have control of their psyche, normal people who have control of their psyches don't go to psychotherapists, okay? And I never have gone to a psychotherapist, but I've been able to mediate my own psychological stuff by myself, by my own common sense. And I think most people can do that, but and therefore it's not such a important warning here for average people, it seems to me, that you might get inflated or you might get deflated when things start coming out of the unconscious. I mean, it's not like it's not like these television ads where there's a monster coming down the street and it's trying to get you type thing. Not at all. I mean, you're getting intimations from your unconscious, things that your unconscious suggests in different ways, and if you pay attention to them, I find that they can help you in your life. But it's not like it's not like Godzilla is going to come down the street and grab you type thing. For most people, I'm not saying people that are mentally ill, that are psychotic.
I would agree.
Different.
I agree, and I also think that what we're seeing, just to drop into the politics just 1 second, before we move on, and I concur on that, that the inflation that someone acts out on typically, I think, comes from a deflation and their terror of being exposed or ousted or moved along, so that they have to act on the inflation to do the duck and cover because they feel deflated somewhere. And the worst part is, I think, when it's actual evil, there's not a deflation, there's not a terror. The inflation has taken hold and rooted as a really naturalized garden, and they think they're all that. I mean, notwithstanding anyone else in the world, because I think as we grow up through adolescence, it's natural for the me piece to happen because, up to 4 or 5, your parents are gods. And then you get the context of the family and you understand that you're different. So you start to get the identity piece forming. But then up through adolescence, that still has a capital M, me to it. And then after that, when you graduate from that, when you self-parent, I find that it becomes more about community, the community within yourself, and then that then breeds the community outside yourself also. So I think we're dealing with some adolescent pieces and, in the warring tendencies that don't have the dignity of difference to stand up and go, yeah, I don't know everything. Let's talk.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we have a lot of psychotherapy today, which wasn't around in 1916 or whenever he wrote this. It was about 1916, I think. So we now have a lot of psychotherapy around, and if people start having troubles with these things, they tend to go see a psychotherapist. And at least in my health insurance policy, I think I'm allowed $1,000 a year in psychotherapy, which
that's
isn't
like sessions. I mean, 8
that.
maybe.
Yeah, it's nothing. So hi, Rhea. I've been thinking about you. Love to chat with you at some point. Anyway, yeah, it just seems to me we've had a lot of things that do provide guidance for people, especially in the last half of the 20th century. We've had lots and lots of movies, and I've seen a lot. And as I say often, my psyche, my unconscious just serves up scenes from movies that are applicable to given situations all the time. So if I'm talking to someone and all of a sudden I get a vision of some movie, I'll probably get the scene and I'll probably get the dialogue too.
And what's interesting, that brings to mind, between the 50s and the 70s, if someone called you an armchair psychologist, it was really a slander. It was really disparaging. But then now, just a normal function of individuation of life, being your own armchair psychologist simply equates to watching your own environmental radar inside and out, and it has nothing to do with the know-it-all syndrome anymore, which is inflation.
Yep. So anyway, let's go on and see where else we get. And Joel, it's nice to see you here tonight. Yeah, paragraph 222. If we analyze these two modes of reaction more deeply, we find that the optimistic self-confidence of the first conceals a profound sense of impotence, for which their conscious optimism acts as an unsuccessful compensation, while the pessimistic resignation of the others masks a defiant will to power, far surpassing a cocksureness and conscious optimism of the first type. Well, we certainly have some people that never grew up properly. I mean, why? I guess I have to go back to the news of the day. Why does Putin feel that he, what does claiming that Ukraine is under Russian control do for Putin? And the answer right now is nothing, and it never will, because he's already gone beyond the pale, I think. And so he never, even if he dominates Ukraine, he never will be accepted in the world again.
I think so. And I think we discussed too, the second paragraph goes into some decent detail in such a short span of the deflation present and the inflation acting out, and that the inflation acting out far surpasses the cocksureness of a conscious optimism of the first type, meaning there we start to enter the land of actual evil.
Yeah, and it's quite obvious that he's quite inflated and didn't understand his own weakness.
Right.
Because he didn't understand that by letting the oligarchs steal defense budget, it meant that his army wasn't getting updated and so on.
Yeah, and could be yanked away by tractors.
And
creativity is part of it. So
yeah, I mean, as we go forward, if the Ukrainians continue to show courage, as obviously people in Vietnam did and people in Afghanistan did, they're going to keep their country. There's no doubt about that.
mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean that everything is going to be rosy in those countries. Actually, in Vietnam, I think that they made an adjustment pretty quickly for the modern world. But with the Taliban, that doesn't seem to be the case. And so things are still pretty rough in Afghanistan, especially for women. But
because multiple vacuums were left there, and that's the
right.
thing, is that indicates a prior lack of development throughout, because you basically get a honeycombed society that has a power issue.
Yeah. But it's obvious that Putin needs something to prove that he's better than the rest of us, and he's just overreached to his detriment. I don't think he ever gets out of that. Somebody's going to assassinate him, or something's going to happen in his lifetime. I'm not saying it's going to happen in the next 2 weeks, but one day when he's least expecting it, a year from now or 5 years from now, somebody with a grudge is going to take him out, is what I expect.
And I think that posturing, that over-explaining, that overcompensating, connotes two things. One, that he's internally threatened, and if not, then he's evil. And two, that there's one thing to show your work, there's one thing to express the process, but when it's explaining or explainy, that's a child petitioning to a misplaced parent.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that then goes back to the lack of self-parenting that applies to both the inflation and deflation in the first paragraph.
Yeah. All right. So go ahead and read on with 223.
Certainly. Paragraph 223. With these two modes of reaction, I have sketched only two crude extremes. A finer shading would have been truer to reality. As I have said elsewhere, every analysand starts by unconsciously misusing his newly won knowledge in the interests of his abnormal, neurotic attitude, unless he is sufficiently freed from his symptoms in the early stages to be able to dispense with further treatment altogether. A very important contributory factor is that in the early stages, everything is still understood on the objective level, i.e., in essence, without distinction between imago and object, so that everything is referred directly to the object. Hence, the man for whom, in quotes, other people are the objects of prime importance will conclude from any self-knowledge he may have imbibed at this stage of the analysis, in quotes, aha, so that is what other people are like, close quotes. He will therefore feel it his duty, according to his nature, tolerant or otherwise, to enlighten the world. But the other man, who feels himself to be more the object of his fellows than their subject, will be weighed down by this self-knowledge and become correspondingly depressed. In parentheses, I'm naturally leaving out of account those numerous and more superficial natures who experience these problems only by the way, close parentheses. In both cases, the relation to the object is reinforced. In the first case, in an active, in the second case, in a reactive sense. The collective element is markedly accentuated. The one extends the sphere of his action, the other the sphere of his suffering.
Okay, I'm not, if you want to opine on that paragraph, you're welcome to. I'm not even getting it, I'm sorry to say.
Well, I think this is an extension of the first paragraph in that the one extends the sphere of his action. The inflated one will, move out of self. And the other, the sphere is suffering, becomes depressed, deflated. I think we're still dealing with this binary dance here, rather than someone who, as he said, leaves treatment altogether because they can and dispense with it, because now they're able to look at the dance partners of the inflation and deflation as more of a heaving set of lungs that back and forth, pendulum swing, except not at the consequent damage to someone's life action. So I think here he's still talking about the inertia of when you're only one or the other, you're kind of at the beck and call of however the wind blows, is what I would opine to. So I think he's still talking about the inflation deflation, but he's going into the one, which would be the inflated one, extends the sphere of his action. The other, the deflated one, extends the sphere of his suffering. So in a sense, they both don't get out of the quicksand of the inflation or the deflation to understand that if you pressurize, you can get your foothold.
Yeah.
I mean, in quicksand, give up.
Yeah. So let's just go on and see if we get something more that we can relate to a little bit more clearly.
Well, totally. So paragraph 224. It's a long.
Yeah, I'll read this
one. Favorite lines. You got it?
Yeah, I'll do it. Okay, paragraph 224. Adler has employed the term godlikeness to characterize certain basic features of neurotic power psychology. If I likewise borrow the same term from Faust, I use it here more in the sense of the well-known passage where Mephisto writes, Eritis sicut Deus scientis bonum et malum, in the Students' Album, and makes the following aside. Just follow the old advice, and my cousin the snake, there'll come a time when your godlikeness will make you quiver and quake. The godlikeness evidently refers to knowledge, the knowledge of good and evil. The analysis and conscious realization of unconscious contents engenders a certain superior tolerance, thanks to which even relatively indigestible portions of one's unconscious characterology can be accepted. This tolerance may look very wise and superior, but often it is no more than a grand gesture that brings all sorts of consequences in its train. Two spheres have been brought together, which before were kept anxiously apart. After considerable resistances have been overcome, the union of opposites is successfully achieved, at least to all appearances. The deeper understanding thus gained, the juxtaposition of what was before separated, and hence the apparent overcoming of the moral conflict, give rise to a feeling of superiority that may well be expressed by the term godlikeness. But this same juxtaposition of good and evil can have a very different effect on a different kind of temperament. Not everyone will feel himself a Superman, holding in his hands the scales of good and evil. It may also seem as though he were a helpless object caught between hammer and anvil, not in the least a Hercules at the parting of the ways, but rather a rudderless ship buffeted between Scylla and Charybdis. For without knowing it, he is caught up in perhaps the greatest and most ancient of human conflicts, experiencing the throes of eternal principles in collision. Well, might he feel himself like a Prometheus chained to the Caucasus, or as one crucified. This would be a godlikeness in suffering, godlikeness in certainly not a scientific concept, although it aptly characterizes the psychological state in question. Nor do I imagine that every reader will immediately grasp the peculiar state of mind implied by godlikeness. The term belongs too exclusively to the sphere of belles lettres, so literature, I guess. So I should probably be better advised to give a more circumspect description of this state. The insight and understanding then gained by the analysand usually reveals much to him that was before unconscious. He naturally applies his knowledge to his environment. In consequence, he sees or thinks he sees many things that before were invisible. Since its knowledge was helpful to him, he readily assumes that it would be useful also to others. In this way, he is liable to become arrogant. It may be well meant, but it is nonetheless annoying to other people. He feels as though he possesses a key that opens many, perhaps even all doors. Psychoanalysis itself has the same bland unconsciousness of its limitations, as can clearly be seen from the way it meddles with works of art.
Yeah, and you were right. Belles lettres is literature, or fine letters, as it would be. So erudite or high intellect, someone who's studied.
Yeah, I mean, so we see Mr. Putin in this situation now where he was unconscious of the weaknesses in his own position, and definitely quite inflated. At the same time, he's giving all of us pause to think about our own situations and what are we unconscious of individually in our own lives that can really end us or tie us to the Caucasus like Prometheus, because that's the inevitable result for Putin. He had a vision of what he could become, sort of the czar of all the Russias, I guess, maybe, but he's getting his comeuppance awfully fast.
Well, it wasn't lost on me that the day the mask mandates were lifted here, the very next day, this all starts. And he sequestered very, very intensely. He was very isolated, but that's him grounding himself in a way. And so now, he lets the door open, and here he comes flying out with all this pent up, I've got to prove stuff. And it's just that. I mean,
so Rhea, we're up to paragraph 224. We've just read. I was asking where we were. So Shannon says here, aren't the youths of Russia doing amazingly better today with adding to the advances in technology and less of them huffing gas as you see in today's American youth culture? I don't think our American youth culture is that degenerate, but what do you think?
I think that's a correct generalization. I think it's apt to a point that America has less discipline and more sloth and less self-direction and literally less direction, and decades, centuries of oppression tend to compress and condense and pressurize. So there's a historical patience piece that I think I would lean in to agree to her dissonance in that, but I don't think America is so degenerate, but I do think we have quite a lot of more adolescence that's making itself into the ages of being elected to power than before. There used to be
Well, I think the adolescence has been emerging from the middle-aged people, the end of the baby boom, and since then till maybe the millennials. But I think the millennials are really wise and see how we of the baby boom haven't answered all the questions, haven't solved all the problems of the world, and they're going to have to step up.
I think you're right, because I think the millennialists also see their parents, whereas for the 30 years before that, with the baby boomers, you had a lot of children running the family. The parents afraid to discipline. The parents afraid to actually parent.
Yeah, everybody gets a trophy.
And everyone wants to be your friend, and I don't want to be, downer on loving families and just simply bless the child instead of discipline them, but don't discipline them punitively. It's correctively. And I think that discernment was lost for 3 generations, so that we had that sloth of people who had not been forced to undergo the rite of passage to frankly leave home, and just start somewhere. And then that lingering adolescence lasts into the ages of being able to be elected into office. And then the tantrums just continue. So I think you're right. The millennialists, I see most of them they'll scoff at what probably should be scoffed at. They'll also not judge and go, well, to each his own. And so they're more accepting, but at the same time with a power of acceptance they don't need to change to become that. So I'm seeing a lot more birth of identity in the millennialists than I am in the 3 generations past. And overall, it's a big crack generalization to pigeonhole whole cultures that way. But I do see a bigger trend in the 30 years prior for that adolescence to be able to be let to hang on.
Yeah, Mo says, I think there's some truth to the claim that American youth are undisciplined. I only take issue when people hold the youth solely responsible for that. Certainly I don't hold youths responsible for that. I hold their parents responsible for it. Jewel, go ahead.
Okay, I know that you can't see me, but I don't know what's happening, but I am listening.
Okay.
I wanted to ask another thing in regards to that about the adolescents and the millennials and everything. It's interesting, and I'm seeing some people that I think that they were so controlled by their parents and didn't have options that there are so many ignorant people, not stupid, but they don't know how to lead. And so that's where they're leading. And I'm wondering how much of this older generation, which I'm in, I wish they'd just step down and let the younger people come in. And I don't know how to pull this together with what's going on, because they will not move out of place. And politics have become so malicious that they're only going to accept certain ones that are in. And the older generation are not going to speak up, almost as we're talking about younger people being so insecure. And they're not going to take a side that once they would have said that's not right, because they would let somebody else come up and say they got a reputation a certain way, let it do it. We'll keep our jobs, we'll keep our pensions, we'll keep all these people that are paying us our dues and giving us our little thing behind the the scenes to keep us in power. And I'm going to say I would love for these other people to do that. I do know there are some people last election tried to do something along that same way, but I've been watching a force behind the scenes, and I'm hoping before the election comes, if the adults can't stand up and be adults, the older politicians can't stand up and do the right thing for the country instead of the right thing for the party to keep their job.
Yeah.
That's my biggest concern. Is how can we, as some people seeing the change, say, pull it together because we're behind
I
you.
appreciate. Well, I think it's interesting to me that generations prior to millennial is, you get grounded and you sulk and you go to your room and you brood and you self bitch and moan, and then you have to figure out what you did wrong. And it seems to me the millennialists, if they got grounded, they're like, oh, cool, I'll just go on the internet and figure out how this argument would play out in court. And they will learn their own communication, their own philosophy by hopping on the internet, and being grounded was actually a place for them, I think, to enact the two most long-lasting things in society are always curiosity and wonderment. And when either of those goes, that's when cultures start to demise. And I appreciate you said, Jewel, I mean, the younger generation, it's not just big Uranian outright shake up change. They have some zeal and some get it done. And also they understand the process takes a while, so that it's not always just about patience, but they will still steer the car of their life away from, the imminent dangers. So pardon, Skip, you were going to say.
Well, I'm fascinated by the conversation here. And, what I believe, I remember seeing a cartoon comic book years ago when I was a kid, and there was a concern in the society of the comic book that Americans were weak and that sort of thing, the same sorts of things that we're seeing now being discussed on the chat. And then somebody took exception to it and said, no, we're united, and people don't understand that. And it's exactly like what we see with Putin right now. He thinks he's got the Russian people behind him, whereas Biden understood that he had to stand with NATO no matter what. And we may indeed get into a World War III, but people will step up for that, no doubt, as we did during the Vietnam War. Many of us, I'm not saying everybody did, because there were a lot of people who were drafted, but I did. I signed up for the Marines and served as an officer for 23 years. And so people will step up when we think it's necessary. And I have no doubt about that. And especially this generation, I have no doubt that they will step up. And I agree with you, Jewel, that my generation has to step aside, because every president since 1992 has been a baby boomer, or right before the baby boom. Biden is a little bit before the baby boom, but we've had like 5 presidents that were in my class in college. Right. Go ahead, Joel.
I'm seeing is taking place. I've been listening to some things on the internet, as you know, Jordan, you said that's how I'm getting my connection. And I guess by me coming in as a female and like I said, 70 years old, I knew what was going on with the war, and I watched it change, and I watched the military change, and I watched, as I said at another time, this was the way to get people out of poverty or out of ignorance and into an opportunity for education and jobs. Our military has taken so much of its budget and put it anywhere but taking care of what we need to do, and in the process destroying our world, destroying our environment. And there's some documents I've read recently, and I'll get them out later and send them out another day, where our our United States defense budget paid a private group, I may have said this earlier, from our defense budget to create the COVID-19 virus. And none of our leaders knew this. In fact, was the one that placed the order for it. So these millennials are finding this stuff out. And so as things are coming forward with it, I don't know what's going to happen, but, you know, to me, I've always said, change the tax laws and you're going to change everything. And that goes back with all of these people that are coming in, you know, the pharmacists and all of that, who have everybody bought. Our politicians are bought. They are not serving America anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I've given up on
I have too,
politicians.
That's where the younger generation,
you know, with the exception of someone like Liz Cheney, and you know, a few others that I see in Congress, who are standing their ground, and typically they're women, by the way.
Yes, they are. That's why I'm speaking as a female. We know what went on when we were there.
Right.
And there are good people there, and they're the ones that had nothing to lose, because there's very few of them. And I do believe that there are the ones there. There's some still good seeds, but we got a whole lot of weeds.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I grew up being forced to watch Crossfire with my dad and stepmom, the political show. Yeah. And I used to always, you know, why do we watch this? They never agree. And the discussion is always, it's just tennis match, one-sided. We're looking for a winner. And it always ended up being education versus money, art versus business, except, okay, that's fine. I get it. Back and forth, back and forth. There's a pendulum. But people experiencing that decades after decade after decade, all they saw was, oh, it's important to have conflict with other people. And it was no longer understood as a Socratic method or as a discussion, even as intense and dirty as it would get. It was still discussion. It became just this itchy, fidgeted agitation that's always dissonant, instead of actually leaning into the dissonance of your quote unquote adversary. The perspective seemed to disappear however long ago. And it became just this melee rather than an actual informative, potentially educational discussion.
Yeah.
Right now, as I'm listening to, we'll talk later outside about letting you know, I don't want to do any other podcast, and I don't listen to them on this, who are actually bringing in professors from colleges that are doing their own individual thing, and they are educating the people. And so in my next role, I'm going to be a neuroscientist, and they're bringing in the people and the things I've talked about, and everything I've said have come from one of the sources themselves, not secondhand, and gave the documents whenever it was pulled from the public about, you know, when the COVID, I found out about it. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have a much more highly educated youth than even in my generation. And, you know, I'm highly educated. I did 10 years of higher education. But even me, I've learned so much just from YouTube. and from various social networks. In the last 10 years, I've learned lots more than I learned in college or graduate school or law school. And so, I mean, I'm thinking of the TED Talk where this Indian man had decided he would put a laptop in an alcove in Chennai and see what happened. And he came back 2 months later, and this little 8-year-old kid comes over to him and says, "We need a faster modem."
Nice.
And
Out of the mouth, wisdom out of the mouth of babes.
Exactly.
Right. If you got it, and back to you, Jordan, that's what I'm doing. And I am reading. I read some fiction books over the weekend. I've read some that are right with what's going on and pulling me into what's going on. And there are some people who tried to get politicians for a third party the last go round. And I don't know what's happening this. I haven't been tracking with them lately. But these were independent people that were independently wealthy, and they only wanted to go in one term. But as you mentioned so much earlier, the system is so old and the wheels are so greased.
Yeah. By the way, I need to interrupt for a minute. Shannon, I allowed your comment, but I think that we need to watch our language, okay? And be careful, because what happened was YouTube mediated your comment because of a word you used. And while I didn't delete your comment because this word is now being heard everywhere, but let's just be respectful and try to not use language that's beyond the pale, if you don't mind. Go ahead.
Without even seeing the comment, I would concur that I remember my dad telling me, I mean, I got so, riled up, angry. I was probably 14 or 15, whatever. And I started cussing, and I was stomping mad. But he taught me a valuable lesson over years that once you enter the expletives, there are some things that can't be said without them. So they're important. But once you enter expletives, you have inherently almost demeaned your argument. Now, it does show how intensely you're backing it, but at the same time, it creates an interference pattern. And I think it outclasses any ability to have clarity, because all of a sudden it becomes tantrum in a way. And even if it's not a tantrum, it's often interpreted as that. And I find that there's a certain wisdom in how to communicate an idea, especially when you're absolutely dissenting something and you're absolutely against it. And I don't know the solution, sometimes humor, sometimes other, but often listening and working back and forth without the expletives. So glad Skip gave you the bye, so to speak, to not abjectly, absolutely delete the comment. But I mean, Jewel, thoughts on, Skip stepped away for just a little bit. I mean, thoughts on, it seems to me when people start to cuss, now I love cussing. Sometimes I think cussing means you're more intelligent. But at the same time, in an argument, not so much. I mean, thoughts?
Well, this is interesting again because of I said something to some people that I knew that they would not like what I said, and I used the word rape, and it was not towards a person, but it was land, and I felt they did. And they looked at me like, what? I said, yes, these people sold something that was for the public use, and they raped this land because of their greed. And I was been bothered with that recently, but I wanted to get their attention, and much beyond that. And now people are looking at me very strongly because of that. But I find out if you are very angry and you get low and down and dirty, you're not going to be heard. But if you use a word like I did, I got their attention, and they're not going to acknowledge what they're doing. And that's okay. I called it on them, and then I was told I had a bad attitude. And I thought, well, but it goes back to what go ahead. I want to hear this, but I agree with what Skip did. And to me, he is modeling awesome behavior by saying, and I'm glad to be part of a channel that said, we don't need to get down and dirty and ugly like our last elections been, where you're destroying everybody's character, and can say something so much more.
Well, I love that you said that, when people turn around and when someone says you have a bad attitude, that's really vague. I mean, I don't know what that means. Psychology is a pretty vast subject, so my attitude is going to be pretty vast too. But when people say you have a bad attitude, I'll often just smile and go, well, you say like that, like it's a bad thing.
Well, and I'll tell you, another man told me 6 months ago or so that was mean. And where I live, after the North Carolina governor closed everybody went home on Friday afternoon because it was closed, get something from the office that says our office is closed. And I knew a man that would be visiting up there that weekend, and I mentioned it to him later. I said the office was closed, but they still held the event, and they flew in from California, and you're on chemo. And if they brought COVID in, and he said, well, that's mean to say. Is it really? Is it really? It's a matter of perspective.
Well, what I've found is that it's very hard to convince people who have set opinions. As Rhea here says, with 7 billion of us here, there will always be the whole spectrum of levels of consciousness in every country and class. And we all have to face that. But I've found that, you know, it's very difficult to change people's opinions. You know, it's marginally possible that that some red state attitudes will be changed by Putin's attack on Ukraine, because many of us in my generation were looking at the possibility of fighting Russians to defend NATO. And our lives were put at risk to do that. And, you know, and the reason is that in the Marine Corps, the 2nd Marine Division is tasked to defend Northern Europe and Scandinavia. And I think it's widely known that we have a pre-positioned war reserve in Norway, which means that we actually have a whole division worth of trucks, tanks, artillery pieces, etc., in Norway to defend the northern flank of NATO. And that's what the Marine Corps trained to, or at least the Eastern Marine Corps trained to during my entire career, aside from Vietnam. And so I guess I don't find it very surprising that a Russian leader is doing what he's doing right now. But I have to say, I'm glad it's in Ukraine and not in Germany, because it could have been in Germany. And in response to Justin, who says, you know, we're not going to fight World War III, let's all pray that we don't, okay? Because we're on the cusp. And you know, I think everybody ought to go to Amazon and order The Guns of August and read what happened that caused the blow up of World War I. Mm-hmm. You know, why did the assassination of one person all of a sudden cause everything to blow up over a period of time? So, and the point is that Dr. Jung, in the Red Book, recounts how he was feeling the collective unconscious and had many dreams and visions in the year before the Guns of August got roaring. And he was caught actually outside of Switzerland when World War I started. But actually, I just was reading this morning, so maybe I will read it. But I don't see this really happening per se right now, because I don't feel it. I don't feel right now, and I'm as intuitive as anyone. I don't feel that we are going to have a World War III. I agree with you in that sense, Justin, but we could lead to that if we're not careful.
But I think Rhea hit the nail on the head. With this many people, this many billion people on the planet, we are always, I mean, crabs pulling each other back into the bucket, some people escaping. The innumerable, or as I think she said, we're always going to have all spectrums of evolution of consciousness on the planet. And I think what to me that does from an actionable perspective, beyond just dignity of difference, comes to one word: community. And everybody has their place. And it's not so much that the intelligentsia are high and the business people are on the higher, and the hunters and the gatherers and this and that. It gets out of the intelligentsia and the plebeian, the high and the low, poverty and ultra riches, to where in a community, it's not a faction of individuals or a set of factions of individuals. It's what is each person's strong point? Let's work with that. And that contributes to healthy community, because then everyone has something to do, because as we all know, idle hands, that's when stuff happens. And honestly, Putin had 2 years sequestering himself in isolation of, I mean, he was still leading, but the idle hands, so to speak, of not being in the driver's seat and doing it actually, in a sense, it was virtually. So I think Rhea's point of all of the spectrums of consciousness are going to exist from here till the dawn of eternity, rather than the dawn of when we started, wherever that was. And I think that brings about the actionable need for community, which doesn't mean so much lay down the arms, but it's ask questions. It's discuss, it's interact, and also you don't have to even agree to disagree. You should understand that everybody's different, like everybody else. So, I mean, and now that's a little utopian, but at the same time, community isn't utopian. When you see municipalities have a comprehensive plan and they develop a community form and identity, those places aren't in survival, they're in thrival, and they're great places to live.
Okay.
So Jordan asked, you said asking the questions, and I think that's the important part. What we're doing is basically asking a bunch of questions, and just keep these younger generation, keep asking the questions, and how can they move forward and get in power.
Mm-hmm. And I think, Skip, you may be going to the same place. It feels like paragraph 225 speaks directly to this.
Okay. I don't know what's in 225, but I want to give everyone a reading from the Red Book, okay? Because everyone right now should be asking yourself, are we going to have World War III or are we not? And fortunately, we have very experienced and wise leaders, both in the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, who are making these decisions for us. And the only thing that we can do is, watch from the cheap seats and hope that our house doesn't blow up tomorrow, as the houses in Ukraine have. And so we have to look at it from what we know from our unconscious, not our book learning. And so I'm going to pick up the Red Book here, and I'm just going to read from an early part of it. I hope nobody minds. But
no, right before you do, to speak just to the point you just made of being thankful that our house is not blowing up in the morning, hopefully. You see people complaining about paying $4 to $7 a gallon for gas, but they willingly stand in line for coffee at $19.65 a gallon.
Yeah. No
I mean, if you run how much a venti or a small or a medium times this many ounces in a gallon, it's $19.65 a gallon.
Right.
At Starbucks or similar.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So Jung is in the process of learning that all of his knowledge is baloney. Okay. And that he better start paying attention to the spirit of the depths. And this leads to what was happening to him at the beginning of World War I. So it's very relevant to us now. So I will read it. But the spirit, okay, so the spirit of this time is like, in this book, it's like the talking heads. And the spirit of the depths is the collective unconscious. Okay, so as he's talking about these things, the spirit of this time is the talking heads on all the channels and the talking heads right now and so on. And the spirit of the depths is the collective unconscious. So here he goes. But the spirit of this time stepped up to me and laid before me huge volumes which contained all my knowledge. Their pages were made of ore, and a steel stylus had engraved inexorable words in them. And he pointed to these inexorable words and spoke to me and said, "What you speak, that is madness. It is true, but what I speak is the greatness and intoxication and ugliness of madness." But the spirit of the depths stepped up to me and said, "What you speak is, the greatness is, the intoxication is, the undignified, sick, paltry dailiness. It runs in all the streets, lives in all the houses, and rules the day of all humanity. Even the eternal stars are commonplace. It is the great mystery and the one essence of God. One laughs about it, and laughter too is. Do you believe, man of this time, that laughter is lower than worship? Where is your measure, false measurer? The sum of life decides in laughter and in worship, not your judgment. I must also speak the ridiculous, you coming men. You will recognize the supreme meaning by the fact that he is laughter and worship, a bloody laughter and a bloody worship. A sacrificial blood binds the poles. Those who know this laugh and worship in the same breath. After this, however, my humanity approached me and said, "What solitude, what coldness of desolation you lay upon me when you speak such. Reflect on the destruction of being and the streams of blood from the terrible sacrifice that the depths demand." But the spirit of the depths said, "No one can or should halt sacrifice. Sacrifice is not destruction. Sacrifice is the foundation stone of what is to come. Have you not had monasteries? Have you not countless thousands gone into the desert? You should carry the monastery in yourself. The desert is within you. The desert calls you and draws you back. And if you were fettered in the world of this time with iron, the call of the desert would break all chains. Truly, I prepare you for solitude." After this, my humanity remained silent. Something happened to my spirit, however, which I must call mercy. My speech is imperfect, not because I want to shine with words, but out of the impossibility of finding those words. I speak in images with nothing else can I express the words from the depths. The mercy which happened to me gave me belief, hope, sufficient daring not to resist further the spirit of the depths, but to utter his word. But before I could pull myself together to really do it, I needed a visible sign that would show me that the spirit of the depths in me was at the same time the ruler of the depths of world affairs. It happened in October of the year 1913, as I was leaving alone for a journey, that during the day I was suddenly overcome in broad daylight by a vision. I saw a terrible flood that covered all the northern and low-lying lands between the North Sea and the Alps. It reached from England up to Russia, and from the coast of the North Sea right up to the Alps. I saw yellow waves, swimming rubble, and the death of countless thousands. This vision lasted for 2 hours. It confused me and made me ill. I was not able to interpret it. 2 weeks passed, then the vision returned, still more violent than before, and an inner voice spoke, "Look at it. It is completely real, and it will come to pass. You cannot doubt this." I wrestled again for 2 hours with this vision, but it held me fast. It left me exhausted and confused, and I thought my mind had gone crazy. From then on, the exact anxiety toward the terrible event that stood directly before us kept coming back. Once I also saw a sea of blood over the northern lands. In the year 1914, in the month of June, at the beginning and end of the month, and at the beginning of July, I had the same dream 3 times. I was in a foreign land, and suddenly, overnight, and right in the middle of summer, a terrible cold descended from space. All seas and rivers were locked in ice. Every green living thing had frozen. The second dream was thoroughly similar to this, but the third dream at the beginning of July went as follows. I was in a remote English land. It was necessary that I return to my homeland with a fast ship as speedily as possible. I reached home quickly. In my homeland, I found that in the middle of summer, a terrible cold had fallen from space, which had turned everything into ice. There stood a leaf-bearing but fruitless tree whose leaves had turned into sweet grapes, full of healing juice through the working of the frost. I picked some grapes and gave them to a great waiting throng. In reality, it was so. At the time when the Great War broke out between the peoples of Europe, I found myself in Scotland, compelled by the war to choose the fastest ship and the shortest route home. I encountered the colossal cold that froze everything. I met up with the flood, the sea of blood, and found my barren tree whose leaves the frost had transformed into a remedy. And I plucked the ripe fruit and gave it to you, and I do not know what I poured out for you. What bittersweet, intoxicating drink which left on your tongues an aftertaste of blood. Okay, so if anybody's having visions of World War III other than Ukrainians, speak now. It's a pretty shocking passage.
It's shocking, but I think the intensity he expressed is admirable, because a lot of people would shelve that, or as he inquisitively said, has my brain gone mad? What's interesting, he didn't say I have gone mad, but has my brain gone mad?
Yeah.
And that's a critical distinction. I mean, and even the flash freeze, that reminds me of the movie The Day After Tomorrow, where,
Yeah.
this vortex just comes down. And I mean, in seconds flat, it goes from 30 degrees to minus 100 or what have you. And that's 4 years, right? 4 years, World War.
No, this was 1913 and 1914. It was about 10 months. Now, Mo says, so this implies that the collective unconscious isn't simply dormant info resulting from evolution, but something that is alive and aware. You can be sure of it. Okay.
And I think rather than this being just precognizance, I personally feel this may be a more apt expression is the unconscious. We're seeing the horizon. You can, red sky at night, sailor's delight, red sky and morn, sailor take warn. And the unconscious sometimes gives us a very concrete, factual, bleeding edge of what's going to happen based on the calculus of what is already happening. We see the horizon. It's basically already happening. Will the storm reach land or will it peter out kind of thing? So rather than keeping it in some oopy-loopy land of, how can you prove your precognizant dreams? I think sometimes we simply just see a little further ahead than others.
Yeah. I was reading from the first chapter of the Red Book called The Way of What Is to Come. Let me just read to the end here because there's only one more page, and it's the next page isn't about World War I, but it's interesting, and it's, if you haven't read the Red Book, and I read it entirely online, so you can have, if you want to hear me read the whole thing, it's there on the YouTube channel. But anyway, here's what he said. Believe me, it is no teaching and no instruction that I give you. On what basis should I presume to teach you? I give you news of the way of this man, but not of your own way. My path is not your path. Therefore, I cannot teach you. The way is within us, but not in God's, nor in teaching, nor in laws. Within us is the way, the truth, and the life. Woe betide those who live by way of examples. Life is not with them. If you live according to an example, you thus live the life of that example, but you should live your own life, if not yourself, so live yourselves. The signposts have fallen. Unblazed trails lie before us. Do not be greedy to gobble up the fruits of foreign fields. Do you not know that you yourselves are the fertile acre, which bears everything that avails you? Yet who today knows this? Who knows the way of the eternally fruitful climes of the soul? You seek the way through mere appearances. You study books and give ear to all kinds of opinion. What good is all that? There is only one way, and that is your way. You seek the path. I warn you away from my own. It can also be the wrong way for you. May each go his own way. I will be no savior, no lawgiver, no master teacher unto you. You are no longer little children. Giving laws, bettering, making things easier has all become wrong and evil. May each one seek out his own way. The way leads to mutual love and community. Men will come to see and feel the similarity and commonality of their ways. Laws and teachings held in common compel people to solitude so that they may escape the pressure of undesirable contact. But solitude makes people hostile and venomous. Therefore, give people dignity and let each of them stand apart so that each may find his own fellowship and love it. Power stands against power, contempt against contempt, love against love. give humanity dignity, and trust that life will find the better way. The one eye of the Godhead is blind. The one ear of the Godhead is deaf. The order of its being is crossed by chaos. So be patient with the crippledness of the world and do not overvalue its consummate beauty.
And that to me is so reminiscent of the late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks and his multi-hour YouTube videos of dignity of difference and dignity and difference. Where he's, that right there is I'm glad you pulled that in, because that answers my question of where in this chapter will be the third option of the healthy version of this inflation and deflation. And you just read it right there.
You know, and that is so beautiful, because I'm reading some of these comments about the Russian, all this information that I've shared with you. It was a fellow who was actually born in Russia, highly educated, and he sees what's there. He brings people in to educate people like me, to say there are people out there working. Talked about AI, artificial intelligence. You know, let us all have dignity and let us do what is basically the best for mankind. Mm-hmm. And that is where I just want to learn more from what's going on behind the scenes that we're not hearing, you know, once they watch the news, maybe back when, but I don't hear it. I find it from the people that are in the source, that are working together, as I think Rhea mentioned earlier, and they're working cross nations, cross oceans to pull together what's best for the world.
Yeah, and we're all doing that. I mean, we currently have 13 people involved in this conversation, and all of us are trying to find our way, but each of us at the same time knows what's right and what's wrong. And so one of the main teachings here is, you know, don't follow somebody else, follow yourself and figure out what's right and wrong.
Yes, and use your voice.
Yeah, and use your voice and use your common sense, and you know, these sessions, although we only have 9 YouTube watchers at the moment, within a day or two, we always have 250 or 300 people who've watched all or a part of these sessions. And so they obviously get out there. And
I like it. Say what you mean what you say, and don't say it mean.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also when people think, some people will put people down. You can't say things like that. You need to go get a PhD before. You can't do that. You need to get this before. They'll always try to demean something on a resume. And a resume is part of history. And the reality is, if you have an idea that's actionable and a perspective that you've developed, odds are you've already suffered. That's part of what caused that. So there's no reason not to share the high quality things that you develop. And they don't have to be bestsellers. But the thing is, you are contributing to then what's the potential influence of the community privacy, that which may influence someone you don't know about. And I think that sharing back and forth is important, instead of the, you know, don't hold yourself back. Oh, I can't say that until I have a PhD. Well, what does that mean? That's just a bunch of shaming behavior.
And it's like the thing that I said when I spoke a truth. A man said, well, that's mean. Is it mean to speak the truth? You know, and again, that it was more bold. It took a lot of courage for me to say that than to let something go that I thought was unethical.
Mm-hmm. And you return serve at the same power and intensity as the serve was delivered. So that's just tennis. That's just a rally.
Well,
which is important. I'm glad you did
that. Yeah. Justin says, well, first of all, Patrick Hollywood says he thinks it's all just a prelude to China taking Taiwan. And I think if China tries to take Taiwan, they're going to be very surprised, because, that's the home of the Kuomintang. And, even the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the Kuomintang are not going to stand for it, just like the Ukrainians. That's my expectation. And, we have worried about this idea that China was very powerful. But, what is powerful today is the international system. Because, I had one of my midshipmen call me one time. He had become an F-18 pilot, and he was flying off aircraft carriers in the Pacific. And he calls me up one time and he says, Skip, even if we have 5 carriers in the Western Pacific to fight a war to defend Taiwan, the Chinese can, and that would be 500 jets, 5 aircraft carriers, 500 jets. The Chinese can put up 3,000 jets against us. And, we can't win that war. And I said, well, don't worry about that, because we owe the Chinese $4 trillion. Okay, they bought our treasury notes. And if we have a war with China, do you think we're going to pay them back? And furthermore, China as an economy relies extremely heavily on the United States above anything else. To a lesser extent, Europe, but the United States is the big market for China. And so if they start a war with us, where are they going to sell their etch-a-sketches and things?
Who financed the COVID? The United States did, and it was developed over there.
I'm sorry.
Speak directly, I think, to the COVID piece, rather than me penning the tail on any given conspiracy donkey. It was time and nature. In fact, it was 5 years late from 1917 and that epidemic. It was going to happen again. It's just, if we took a hold of it, well, we just, basically dance with nature. So I don't know that we can actually source COVID from that forensic perspective, because I find that most of that stuff gets a little blustery and gets a little, honestly, it gets too polished. And it's, to me, and then that means it doesn't hold its water. I just have to say, not in disagreement so much, is that we were due for a pandemic. They've happened approximately every 100 or so years. That's how nature, it's a cycle. It's just like geography and geology and weather. It's just it's like the floodplain. Is it a 100-year floodplain? Are you dealing with a 500-year floodplain? If you're dealing with a 100-year pandemic or a 500-year pandemic.
I know I like what you're saying, because what I'm seeing is that the world got together and to solve something, versus it's not one country or another country. It is nature doing its thing and pulling together. And that's where I'm back to have communication that's open communication. And back to what I was talking about earlier, is the people that are knowing behind the scenes are letting us know things that would not necessarily be out, or sending resources to everybody. So I do like what you said.
1917, and then we have what, instead of Putin coming out of the closet of his office and, to the world, we had the roaring 20s. So everyone's like, tired of it. So all of a sudden, woohoo, let's have a party that lasts about a decade. I think it's interesting. I find we have to be careful about what's suppressed, what's depressed, what's inflated, what's deflated, because you get a lot of reactionary living physics occurring. in society from an historic perspective, instead of going, okay, cool, we don't have to deal with that anymore. Let's move on, but just more intensely. I mean, we don't need to, explode the volcano, so to speak.
Well, and I like what is happening because of the medicine that's taking place now and what they're looking at with pulling people together.
Yeah, it has its assets in all fronts. I mean, and then it also puts nose rings in people's noses and drags them around from false fronts. I mean, like false flags, so to speak.
Okay, I'm going to pause a halt here at 2:25 because I do want to respond to some of these YouTube comments. And just looking ahead a little, I think 2:25 at Seek should be kept together. So happy Pi Day, everyone. Today is
3141562 Can't remember more.
Right, 314. And I have a long history with Pi Day.
Well, we used to joke.
We won't go into that today.
Well, the joke, we're dealing with the area of a circle, pi r squared. The professor would always go, no, pi r round.
Yeah. So Justin says, Patrick says, common sense is currency. And, I agree with that. And, obviously even Biden is going to Europe today or tomorrow, I think. And, people are going to talk. Justin, who tends to look through a looking glass darkly, I think, Justin, he says, it's a rearrangement of alliances, the world divided into camps, both trying to loot as many resources as possible. Russia, China, India, Pakistan, and some Arab states will join up and be the biggest. Well, actually, no, they won't, Justin, because Russia and China have always been afraid of one another, and they have one of the longest borders in the world.
Well, and India's bureaucracy would scoff at the amateur level of bureaucracy in any other company, including the United States, because the British may have invented bureaucracy, but the Indians perfected it. Right.
And then Justin says, together, India and Pakistan alone has more than half of the world population. Well, that's not true, because the last time I looked at Pakistan's population, it was 140 million. It may be approaching 200 million today, but you add that to 1.3 or 1.4 billion in the Indian population, and you get maybe 1.7 or 8 billion if you took both of them. And we have 7.6 billion or something, almost 8 billion humans on the planet. So that's not half the planet. And it's not like they're going to ally and be against the rest of us. They're not.
Well, and the thing with population demographics and these kind of situations is you can't expect a whole country to evacuate and attack. I mean, and leave their land. I mean, that would be like in Risk saying, I'm going to move out of Kamchatka, and then someone else goes, how'd you get out of there? I mean, so the land is then free. I don't think that's going to happen. By populace, China is the biggest. Russia actually does not have a very large population. They just have a huge landmass. And part of that
but their population is as big as the United States.
Right.
A little bigger, maybe. But anyway, Justin says, I don't think the U.S. will ever pay back its debt to China. Bingo. Correct.
So, that might be a reason for a war. I mean, from China's perspective, I mean, the old debt collector comes a calling.
Yeah, but that's not going to happen because the U.S. has never reneged on its debt, and everybody in Congress knows that if we renege on our debt, that's sort of the end of the road.
Well, in
And
debt these days, I mean, in the 70s and the 80s, $100 million or more debt was actually a percentage of the GDP and how interest rates were actually worked. Now it's leveraged debt, and it's just another figure on the books, and it's part of the calculus of how the economies work across the world.
yeah, so I mean, all these little green electrons running around the world.
Why did you think
So-
the younger generation's trying to get another currency going? Which is
So they can make debt differently. It's like-
Yeah, well, which they are doing, and
Right.
even my wife is actively participating, and I'm trying to with the NFT phenom very unsuccessfully so far.
Well, you know, he who has the gold rules, but then he who has the leveraged debt has the potential to stay and rule because they're always going to have this other money that might come in. I mean, so there's a whole, it's like 19 people playing tennis on the same tennis court. I mean,
Yeah. So Captain Blimp says, I've never met a Russian. Well, it may be coming to your town sometime soon. No, my sense is that this is not going to blow into World War III, but it isn't because our saber rattlers have any common sense. I mean, they probably know that it can't happen, because if it does happen, we're all ended. and so, you know, then whatever you have goes away. I mean, if they allow World War III, so they can't.
you know, and I think to that point, historically, this is a time where we are required to deal with this, because if we do not have World War III, there's going to be a compressed tension of closed systems that were unresolved and continue to build up. This is the time for communication. This is the time for, and I mean intense communication, not just, let's make
assuredly it's going on. There's no doubt that it's going on.
Right, but I think this time it shouldn't be who's going to grease whose hands. This is a global. This is the megalopolis. The world is a community, not just any given metropolis.
Yeah. So Justin, thank you for the number on Pakistan. I'll put that in my noggin for future. 220 million. That's pretty amazing. That's gone up 80 million since 20 years ago when I was actively going to Pakistan.
They've been busy.
Yeah. And Justin says, in an economical sense, the USA behaves as an oligarch. Well, surely that's true. Whoever.
No pushback from me on that.
Yeah.
But I think we just fancy ourselves the pretty oligarch. So, and I think that can be, it has its own dangers.
Now, Justin claims Russia is only 144 million. Is that right? That sounds
right. That's why I
low.
said small. They have, of course, there's Siberia, and it takes a special kind of constitution to live there. So, I mean, frankly, if you live there, I respect you. That's because that's not an easy life.
Yeah,
that's beyond the Donner Party. I mean, the Donner Party.
So, right. So Justin says Russia is a mere 144 million. China is 1.4 billion. EU is 447.7 million. Geographical Europe is a bit uncertain, but it was 746.4 million.
And the United States,
330 or something like that. Maybe it's 335 now or something. But that's not the point necessarily, because it's not like all those people are going to form up together and work happily together. And
Like I
things.
said, the odds of a whole country evacuating so everyone can attack are slim to none. Because I mean, it's like Churchill protecting the art. If we lose that, what are we fighting for?
Yeah, what are we fighting for? Absolutely.
And Annabelle said Iceland is 331. I mean, tiny little Iceland, 371,000. So, I mean, that's a lot for such a small place. That's 371,000 smart people living in a beautiful land. I mean, I think.
At least they have free heat, I guess.
And if not, go jump in the hot spring.
Yeah. Joel, do you have your hand up freshly, or is that an old hand?
No, I'm sorry. I didn't realize I'll take it down. I don't know how to get this work. My computer's not working right.
Okay, well, I can get it down for you. I just wanted to know if I'm missing something. So Jewel, you get the last word here, given that we've been gamming on. Have you gotten anything of worth out of this 2 hours?
I believe in the goodness of people.
Me too.
There are people that are bad, but I do believe that this unconscious, as I've talked about working together, have been working together through everything, and hope that enough wise people will step down where some are, and enough young people will keep coming forward.
Me too. So I'm very hopeful that anybody that has dreams about what the future can be. Annabelle says Iceland is 371. Okay, I guess that 1,000. Yeah, if you have dreams or visions like Dr. Jung was having at the beginning, before World War I broke out, please let me know. I'd be interested in knowing what your dreams are. So far, I'm not having those dreams at all. And my sense is that cooler minds will prevail. I don't know how. Okay, but my sense is that they will prevail.
Yeah, I've been having some relatively big dreams, but relative to society, they would be gibberish. I think there are more bigger things that are happening within me. So
yeah,
they didn't seem crazy enough for them to apply to society, honestly. So
yeah, I mean, Jung's dreams, which he recounts in this first chapter of the Red Book, are obviously very big dreams and very big visions that he was having. And so somehow he was tuned in to something that was going on in the collective in Europe that most people didn't see, really. They knew. Pardon?
I think that, you've said you wouldn't want to be a psychologist. You wouldn't want to have your psyche and other people's psyche 8 hours a day. I kind of think because he did, that was another avenue to his connection to the collective unconscious and to his own capital S self, because he was experiencing the variety of people regardless.
Yeah.
So he wasn't playing an empathy game of being connected to people who were similar to him. He was simply connected to people, notwithstanding any of their sensibilities. So I think and that he started in the mental hospitals with the intense extreme cases.
Yep.
That's not most people in the first place. So
yeah,
he had a lot of experience with difference in psyches. And I think then his ability to express the calculus of that and condense it into what we see in the collected works, that's a noble gesture. And I think that's also whereas Freud was a little more isolated to the intelligentsia and his own religion, from a standpoint, actually. But I think the variety of his experience contributed to the clarity of him being able to boil it down. And I think back to what Jules said. I mean, the unconscious working together through each of us.
Yeah.
And people being.
So that doesn't rule out the possibility that just average people might have big dreams about this sort of thing going forward. But you know, I'm not sensing that we're in a existential risk at this point. I think
we're in a milestone in the moment, an evolutionary threshold.
And while I agree that it may be a time that we're doing some realignments, obviously that does make sense. But you know, we did a realignment with China in 1974. Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon did that, and the result of that was we shipped our entire industrial base to China. And, you know, people don't really understand that that's what our oligarchs did. They gave our industrial base to China.
Well, even in a wide time frame, I mean, the U.S., even in a wider time frame, more of the geologic history of a culture, the United States is undergoing its Pluto return, which is 247 years, 243 years. But I call it the empire cycle. Every 250 years, if an empire does not recalibrate, retune, redirect, then it fails. And what's interesting here is the way Biden is judiciously not just jumping in with both feet, that it's more of a, well, we're going to play the we're with NATO game. Well, World War II, NATO, you know, we didn't have that kind of thing that was established. And so I think that instead of a complete overhaul of society, which a Pluto return might warrant, the overhaul is actually the U.S. being a community with NATO, instead of being the figurehead and the spearhead, and everyone looks to us as the, you know, world bully with pretty hands, so to speak. There's a connection that's happening, I think, by allowing the connection with NATO to flourish, not just because Putin said this or that. You know, so to me, it's a subtle shift, but that seems to be systemic, and that's my hope.
You know, I've known for, I guess, 12 years that Twitter represents the collective unconscious. Okay, if you go watch Twitter for an hour, you're going to know what, you know, most people are thinking who are in the Twitterverse, at least, and they're in every country except Russia and China right now.
Well, you know, and I guess, you know, that speaks why I left Twitter. It was too much. I mean, I'm like distracting from my work, so I get lost on it. I mean, you get lost swimming in the world. But
I think it's a mistake to unplug yourself from Twitter. I mean, as a nation state, Russia unplugged itself, and, you know, I don't know, I suppose they'll all restart Russian access to these things. And maybe the Chinese will see that they're benefited by being connected to this collective unconscious.
Well, media has done that in the last several decades, because I think actually, I think Saddam Hussein took the coupon of dismissing a great deal of his intelligence people and just got a subscription to CNN.
Yeah. Well, it's
obvious. They told him everything he needed to know.
It's obvious that CNN has a great intelligence service.
They were just telling everything happening all the time. There's no surprise attack anywhere because we already saw that about 4 hours ago. We prepared.
Right.
We know you're there. Don't even knock on the door.
Yeah. So I'm believing not only in American youth, but in youth around the world to do smarter things than we did at the end of the warfare back and forth days. I mean, if you look at the history of the world, there's always this push and shove, and we still do see it in certain parts of the world today. But I think what we're going to see at the end of this is that somebody who thinks he's a superpower may not be. And, and maybe there's a better way to do things.
Well, there is, and I think also we can kind of put down, as in to death, the notion that we need to king of the mountain things. It's time. The NATO mission is more of a global seed to then work for consensus. And that doesn't mean, oh, I'm going to walk into your country, blazing guns. There's a lot of things. For example, it reminds me of the 60s, and I was just born, but the movements then, if they would have had Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, etc., the coordination across the world happens to a stalemate quickly and make for, unfortunately, more sensational actions have to be taken, or they get stifled and they don't need to happen.
Yeah. Now, Patrick has made a couple statements that are untrue. He says that, so the collective unconscious has worked. It is, thank God we control that. Well, no, it isn't. You may think you're working it, but you're not. And,
Twitter would be not I think Twitter's not the collective unconscious. I think Twitter is the flocking behavior generated by the collective unconscious.
Well, maybe it's not the collective unconscious per se. And I was being, I don't know, obtuse, I guess. No, I don't mean that Twitter is the collective unconscious, but
no, I get it.
It's like a gauge on the collective unconscious.
Yeah, I think I don't think you were wrong. I think that it's just like you set the volleyball up for someone else to come spike, and then I miss, and then you go, oh, someone else needs to hit it over the net. But I think that you're right, though. The collective unconscious is a pool that's conduited, fed, fueled by the collective unconscious. And in a global averaging way, it shows us the flocking behavior of how people are reacting, but not necessarily how the responses are there. Because the responses would be smaller, fewer, and the reactions would be greater and more superficial, but louder.
Well, let's face it, no matter how much we yak here or people chat, none of us are going to make a difference to this thing. And simply because we're feckless with respect to it. I mean, I don't have a Marine Corps at my beck and call as President Biden does. And
I just have my pen, and I will say it's probably not mightier than the sword. Definitely. I mean,
well, it might be mightier than one person's sword, but it's not mightier.
Yeah, but not in a global kind of scale.
Right. And so I won't say
I've never heard of the butterfly effect.
Say it again.
Oh yeah. The butterfly
you're
effect.
Saying we're not worth going to make anything. I said, have you never heard of the butterfly effect?
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, obviously.
Do you know how many wings flapped in Japan when I just said that, and when Skip said that, and you said that?
Obviously, I have been doing this YouTube channel now for 6 years, and obviously, I believe that it has an effect and has had an effect. It may be an effect that only I can discern, but I guess there are people like Jordan and Jewel who think it's worth spending time working with it. And people like Patrick and Justin Case, who keep joining us. And Justin says,
well, and I say Justin's dark lens is an important lens because
sure,
it's not pessimistic and it's not even realistic. I think it's simply important as that perspective is different from the ones here.
Exactly. We don't all think the same.
Right. Now, Justin
research.
Justin says, by the way, Russia has lots of land, China not. About 2050, large parts of the densely populated Northwest China will be uninhabitable for humans due to climate change. China's leaders know that. Well, Justin, I just want to point out to you that in the northwest of China, there is the Gobi Desert, and it's already uninhabitable. And the way people get around in the Gobi Desert is there are truck convoys that resupply oases around the Gobi Desert. And basically you hitch a ride on a truck that's going in the general direction of where you want to go. And if you're lucky, you get back to where you started. But anyway, it's not only that, it's, much more intense things like China has dammed the Ganges River in 17 places. If China were to cut off that water, it prevents about a quarter of the population of India from getting water. And that would not be a good thing. Right. I'm sure they know it,
Not at all.
but yes, there are really, really big issues that relate to natural resources that can cause huge dust-ups in the world and in some of our lifetimes. Maybe I won't live to see it, but I don't doubt that the Ganges River water issue is one of the biggies. And if
When you
something
cut off the water, the dust up is literal. I mean, it's
well, yeah, the dust up is literal. Maybe you can't cut it off because the Tibetan plateau is going to melt, whether we like it or not, whether China likes it or not. And so I imagine the dams might be threatened by too much water too. This is God's mysterious ways to correct things. But
we have the same water issue within the United States. I mean, Texas has oil, Colorado has water. We always called it the white gold, the clear gold. I mean, because there's so many LLCs in Colorado that own water. And it's almost absurd. I mean, it's hidden, but it's very there.
I want to go back then to what you're saying, and there was I just lost it. And it may tie into what just past it. It's one of the comments about the families that control them. I don't know if they were talking about companies, you were talking about LLCs. What I've been looking at is like local banking within the United States where I live. I go back and I see if it's a public bank or a private bank. And if it's a private bank, and I found out, which one is it? Bank of America is a privately owned bank. And I didn't know that. So I went, I'm going to have to go to a public bank. And it should those little things like that just made me do some research. And so, how credit cards go out to everybody all the time. And I just traced it all the way back to who the mother bank was.
Yeah, beware of that stuff. That's for sure.
Yeah, and they're actually a child. I mean, relative to a couple of the larger banks
and that's
that are private.
But that's why when you're saying the LLCs and the laws and the people, but use the voices to inform everybody.
Yeah, and I have to say, I'm not being disparaging about people in Colorado having LLCs and water rights. Half of it is, yes, that's their income, and the other half is probably a tax reason. I mean, it's
well, and
capital gains when you're LLC'd. I mean,
Yeah, but that's cold comfort, Jordan,
Right.
because if people are thirsty, they will come take your water, and
It's
they
true.
will say, the hell with your LLC. So,
Well, no, and that's the thing, is it's kind of more the quiet oil, the black gold. But I just always found it interesting. The clear gold was water, and I didn't realize how not free it was, until when I found that out 15 or 16 years ago.
yeah. Okay, well, let's wrap it up. And we'll see you next week. We'll start on, I guess, 225, which is where we stopped.
But good to see you, Skip, and good to unsee you, Jewel. That's
Good to see you fellas.
Good that you're back. I guess we'll have.
But I'm just down below in South Carolina, but I'm here.
Yeah.
Nice.
Well, we'll have to see what's happening to Nick and a few other people to see whether what's going on. But anyway, peace. See you soon, folks.
Sounds good.
Bye-bye.